And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my graduate student, Joseph Pagliano, who is a third-year doctoral student in our PhD in Educational Neuroscience program. Take it away, Joseph. Thank you, Dr. Quant. And hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. First and foremost, welcome to the PhD in Educational Neuroscience Distinguished Lecture Series hosted by Gallaudet University. Today's lecture series aims to honor world-renowned scientists in the fields of psychology, education, cognitive sciences, and neuroscience. These different fields, and all of the interdisciplinary fields in between, contribute to the new and growing field of educational neuroscience. They increase our understanding of the human mind, as well as the neural mechanisms of learning. This year's distinguished lecture theme is exploring the foundations of human development and consciousness. I'm so honored to introduce our distinguished lecturer today, Dr. James R. Booth, who is a Patricia and Rhodes Hart Professor of Educational Neuroscience in the Department of Psychology and Human Development at Vanderbilt University, where he also directs the Brain Development Laboratory. Dr. Booth received his PhD from just up the road at the University of Maryland, College Park, and went on to complete his postdoctoral training at Carnegie Mellon University before working as a professor at Northwestern University, as well as UT Austin. Dr. Booth's current lab focuses on the development of language and reading, and how this is related to other cognitive processes, such as numerical cognition and executive function. He looks at support for both typical and understudied populations. Dr. Booth's scholarship has been consistently and simultaneously funded by renowned funding sources and mechanisms. And this has been for over 3 decades. From this, Dr. Booth and his collaborators have published over 250 peer-reviewed works. Recent work in Dr. Booth's lab investigates the role of various educational interventions for improving cognitive functions. By furthering our understanding of the brain basis for learning, his work profoundly supports the field's mission in ensuring better outcomes for learning for the next generation of students. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Booth. At this time, I'd like to turn over the floor to you, Dr. Booth, and thank you again, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you so much for the introduction. It's my pleasure to be here to share some of the work that we do in the lab. Yeah, really looking forward to presenting to you, but also hopefully having a discussion at the end of the talk. Let me go ahead and just get up the presentation. So I will share part of my screen and get the slideshow going. Okay, so can you see just the title slide at this point? Great.
Yes, we can.
It's working. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about the brain bases of language development today. again, thanks for having me present about our work. I'd like to thank Gallaudet University, but also the Educational Neuroscience Program and the Visual Language and Learning Center. Most of what I'll be talking about today is supported by the federal government, actually the National Institute of Deafness and Other Communication Disorders is the primary supporter of the work that I'll be talking about today. I'll be featuring the work of graduate students and postdocs in the lab. This is actually a montage of all of the students in my lab over the years. Of course, I'm not going to be talking about all of their work, just a subset of these folks. And actually, you're going to see the picture of the person that I'm highlighting in the lower kind of left hand corner of the screen. So I won't explicitly acknowledge them, but you'll see their picture and acknowledgement. And then finally, I'd just like to thank the lab in general, particularly the families who have participated in the studies over the years. Without this work, without their participation, we wouldn't be able to do this work for sure. So I really appreciate the commitment that families have to furthering research. Okay, with that aside, I'd like to start out with an outline of what I'll be talking about today. I'm going to start out with why talk about language acquisition, and then move to consider neurocognitive models of development. And then the bulk of the presentation will be talking about phonological versus semantic specialization, and then talking about semantic versus syntax specialization, and then end up with some future directions. So why talk about developmental language acquisition? One reason is that, it can break down. Some have called this developmental language disorder, and it's actually a very common condition in childhood. Parents and teachers know about dyslexia and ADHD, but often they don't know about developmental language disorder. So that's why some researchers talk about it as the most common childhood condition you've never heard of. There's similar kind of lack of awareness for other neurodevelopmental conditions such as dyscalculia. Developmental language disorder is not widely acknowledged, but it is common. Depending upon the definition, the prevalence of developmental language disorder will vary. This table shows the prevalence rates under different criteria. Let's pay attention to just the first two here. Researchers I call it kind of language disorder of unknown origin because it's developmental as compared to frank neurological damage. In the past, we've used terms like specific language impairment, but the best estimates from these studies is that developmental language disorder affects about 7% of the population. So those previous epidemiological studies showed that developmental language disorder is prevalent, but how severe is it? If you look at this interesting kind of graph here, you can see DLD, or specific language impairment as it was previously referred to, is about kind of in the middle in terms of severity. So it's moderate severity. This is an interesting study that's actually a follow-up of an earlier study done by Dorothy Bishop, which looked at the relationship between severity and how much research attention, as indicated by number of publications, a neurodevelopmental disorder received. And this graph shows there's kind of linear relationships. So as severity increases, the number of studies on that neurodevelopmental condition increases. However, if you look at this, if you look at DLD, given its severity, DLD does not receive enough research attention. So it's clearly below the confidence interval, similar to speech sound disorder, dyscalculia, or dyslexia even. So clearly we need more research in this area. So why study language acquisition? One reason is that language disorders are common, and the other is that they affect the daily function of children. So, so next I'd like to kind of frame our work in the context of neurocognitive models of development. So one of the main kind of theoretical approaches that we use to kind of conceptualize our work is the interactive specialization model of brain development. So this model argues that the onset of a new kind of behavioral ability is due to the changes in interaction between brain regions. So the central idea is that this change in interaction between brain regions allows for the emergence of brain specialization, and that's reflected in behavioral gains. So throughout this talk, we're going to talk about a lot about specialization for language, but we also talk about how that specialization may emerge from the interaction between brain regions. So this is a general model of brain development, but I'd like to contextualize that in this kind of this more specific model that talks about language processing. So this model can be roughly kind of divided into two pathways. The model argues that there is a ventral pathway involved in semantic processing, or the meaning of words. This is indicated in this figure in kind of blue and pink. So you can think about the MTG and this inferior frontal area, Brodmann's area 45 and 47, as being involved in semantic processing. The model additionally argues that there's kind of a dorsal pathway involved in processing syntax, or your knowledge of grammar. So this involves this green area and this orange area. So we're talking about posterior superior temporal gyrus, and also kind of more superior regions of the inferior frontal, involving Brodmann's area 44 in particular. So the dorsal pathway is certainly involved in processing syntax, but it's also involved in processing other rule-based systems such as phonology, or the sound structure of words. So we're going to simplify that model and you know, kind of talk about a dorsal pathway, which is involved in phonology and syntax. This pathway is also involved in motor control, particularly articulation. And then we're going to contrast that with a ventral pathway, which is involved in semantics. More generally, it seems to be involved in like audiovisual processing. So I'm going to refer back to this model quite a bit during the presentation in terms of these different pathways. So I'm going to do so in the context mainly of a study that we completed at University of Texas at Austin, but we're still looking at the data. I should note that this data is shared, so anybody can look at it at any time. You can download it from Open Neuro. It's a large-scale longitudinal neuroimaging project of language processing in 5, 7, and 9-year-olds. Yeah, we've shared this data, but we continue to publish studies on it. So the project had 5 overlapping kind of aims. In this talk, I'm going to talk mainly about the first question, so in regards to language specialization in young children. The other questions are listed here, and I'll briefly come back to those at the end, and I'm going to provide some tentative answers, but I'm going to focus on the first question for this presentation. So as I indicated, our first goal was to establish specialization in young children. The previous work on specialization had been limited, so they focused on older kids, a larger age range. They studied just the visual modality. They used a single task. So at the time we were publishing some of these papers, there was no convincing demonstration of oral language specialization in young children. So that was really the goal of the couple studies that I'll focus on today. So back to the outline, our first order of business was to do kind of a deepish dive into specialization of the phonological versus the semantic pathway. So we kind of did this in the context of sound and meaning judgment tasks. The sound judgment tasks tapped into phonological processing. We asked the participants, do two words have any of the same sounds? This involved three different conditions: a rhyme condition, an onset condition, and an unrelated condition. In addition, we used a meaning judgment task. This task asked the participants, do the two words go together? This involved, again, three word conditions: a strong association condition, a weak association condition, and an unrelated condition. For both tasks, you can see there was a perceptual control here. In our analyses, we're going to focus on the critical lexical conditions that involve a yes response. These are highlighted in red. So examples of our sound task are pairs like wide and ride, or coat and cup. Examples of our meaning task are pairs like dog and cat, save and keep. So these were pairs of words, and they were sequentially presented by headphones. They were presented for about 1 second each, during which a blue dot was presented. Following the presentation of the words, there's about a 2 to 3 second interval. And in the last 100 milliseconds, there's like a yellow dot that appears warning the child to respond before the beginning of the next trial. I'm not going to focus too much on the behavior here, other than to say that performance on the task was reasonable for this kind of age range of 5-year-old children. You know, the range is from like about 60 to 80%. As you can see here, the sound judgment was a little more difficult, especially for the onset condition. But overall, the 5-year-old children could effectively do these tasks. What I'd like to focus on is the brain data. So this is a map of the group in terms of activation. And what you can see here is that kind of both tasks kind of activated predominantly left hemisphere network, but bilateral, you can see here. Mainly superior to middle temporal bilaterally, and then left inferior frontal cortex. You can see here that the meaning task is indicated in blue. The sound task is indicated in red, and overlap between the two is indicated in purple. So the activation pattern that you see here is roughly consistent with what's been reported in the literature, and is roughly consistent with the neurocognitive model that I outlined at the beginning. But of course, the goal, the central goal, was to see if we could establish specialization in young children. So I'm going to step you through this figure because it's a little bit complicated. In the superior temporal gyrus here, you can see that the sound task or the phonological task showed greater activation than the meaning task. That's an index of specialization. That's indicated in red here. Turns out that that task difference was also correlated with an independent measure of phonological awareness skill. That's indicated here in purple. And then the final color here shows in yellow that the onset was greater than the rhyme. And then overlap between these maps is indicated here in orange. So all of this together indicates phonological specialization, and that is related to skill. In the middle temporal gyrus, the more ventral pathway, you can see here that the meaning task produced greater activation than the sound task. That's indicated in blue. This task difference was correlated with an independent measure of vocabulary skill, which is indicated here in green. And then the weak items showed greater activation than the strong items, indicated in cyan. These activation clusters didn't quite overlap, but they were proximal. So together, both of these results suggest that, yeah, the dorsal pathway seems to be specialized for phonological processing. The ventral pathway seems to be specialized for semantic processing. You may have been wondering that I don't see differences in specialization in frontal cortex. And we did not show specialization in frontal cortex. It's possible that frontal cortex is late developing or that we need more sensitive analytical methods to detect this specialization. Remember, this study was on 5-year-olds. With older children, we'd expect to see some specialization in frontal cortex. This is the most recent review of word processing. It's about a decade old now, but this review on older children suggests some specialization in frontal cortex. So they looked at phonology tasks and semantic tasks, and they showed an effective task in this kind of inferior frontal region. So phonological tasks engaged Brodmann's area 44 more, whereas semantic tasks engaged Brodmann's area 45 and 47 more. So this task difference is indicated in purple here. However, this review was primarily in older kids, and it was primarily with reading. So, so we have some subsequent published studies showing, in fact, that there is specialization in frontal cortex in older children in our rhyming task in the auditory modality. But I'm not going to present those today. But overall, it seems as though there's maybe like a developmental shift, earlier specialization of temporal cortex, later specialization of frontal cortex. What I'd like to share with you today, though, is some preliminary work that we've done, some of our newer work. We've become very interested in whether the specialization is related to the home literacy environment. So we pre-registered this project, and I can present to you some preliminary results today. It's currently kind of under review. So we looked at amount of parent to child reading, and we looked to see whether that was correlated with specialization in temporal and frontal cortex. And the data is represented here in this figure. So in 7-year-olds, we showed that the meaning produced greater activation than the sound task in inferior frontal and superior temporal. In these 7-year-olds, we also showed that the low association produced higher activation than the high association. I should say greater activation than the high association. Also in temporal cortex. That was in the 7-year-olds. And then the 5-year-olds are indicated here. You can see that the sound task produced greater activation than the meaning task in temporal cortex, and the onset produced greater activation than the rhyme, also in temporal cortex. So we got no difference for the meaning task in the 5-year-olds, and we got no difference for the sound task in the 7-year-olds. So this is promising work overall, which shows that home literacy environment seems to be related to specialization in the brain. This would be the first demonstration of that. But broadly, it's consistent with some of the developmental behavioral work out there, suggesting kind of the early role of phonological processing in younger readers and the later role of semantic processing in older readers. Yeah, so we're currently following up this work, with our structural measures of diffuse and tensor imaging. So yeah, please stay posted for that work. We've just actually loaded the pre-registration for that, so we haven't even looked at the data yet. Okay, so in summary, the first study showed evidence for some specialization in the phonological versus semantic pathway in young children. Our second goal was to examine whether we can establish specialization in the semantic versus the syntax pathway in children of the same age. So we designed some sentence comprehension tasks. These were parallel tasks, one tapping into semantics, the other one into syntax. In the semantic task, children were asked, does the way she speaks make sense? So there were kind of 3 sentence types here: strongly congruent, weakly congruent, and incongruent. In the syntax task, the kids were asked, does the way she speaks sound right? And there were 3 conditions here: a grammatical task, a finiteness violation task, a plurality violation task. In these 2 tasks, there were also perceptual controls, which you can see here. In our analysis, we focused just on the yes responses. So the sentence tasks requiring yes responses that were most parallel between the conditions. These are the correct sentences. So hopefully they're reflective of kind of more naturalistic processing. An example of the semantic task would be, last week she baked 2 cakes. An example of the syntax task would be like, every day they play 1 game. So in both of these tasks, auditory sentences were presented for about 3 to 4 seconds each, during which a blue dot was presented. After the stimuli, there was about a 2 to 3 second response interval. Again, a yellow dot appeared kind of near the end for the last second to warn the child to make a response before the beginning of the next trial. Again, I won't focus too much on the behavioral data other than to say that the children could do these tasks pretty effectively. So these are 5-year-olds, right? And their accuracy was kind of in the range of 70 to 80%. You can see here that the grammaticality judgment was a little more difficult than the semantic plausibility task, but overall, behavior shows that the 5-year-old children were doing pretty well on the task. So in terms of activation, both tasks activated a bilateral network, including mainly the lateral temporal cortex, which you can see here. This temporal cortex was activated by both tasks. So here in red, you can see the grammaticality judgment task. And in orange, you can see the semantic plausibility task. And then overlap between the two is indicated here in green. We were actually a bit surprised that we didn't see activation in the inferior frontal gyrus. However, it could be that there are big, individual differences which kind of have masked the activation in the frontal cortex for some children. So yeah, our goal was to look at specialization. We chose to actually use a technique called MVPA, or multivoxel pattern analysis. Some of you may not be familiar with this particular approach, so I'll kind of step through the rationale of the approach, so hopefully everybody's kind of on the same page. So in this approach, you can extract some number of voxels, so amount of activation for this, cubic volume. So we extracted 250 voxels in our regions of interest. And then we correlated this pattern both within a task, so within the syntactic or within the semantic, or between task or across task. So the basic reasoning is that if within task correlations are larger than across task correlations, that is indicative of specialization. So the figure here you can see is a hypothetical situation, and the darkness of the voxel represents kind of amount of activation. So if you look at within the syntactic task, so run 1 and run 2, the pattern looks roughly similar. But if you look across tasks, so the syntax versus the semantic, you can see that these two patterns are quite different, right? So, so this hypothetical illustration shows evidence for specialization, larger within task than across task correlations. Yeah. So we use this approach to look at specialization. And you can get, varying degrees of evidence for specialization. So this is kind of a hypothetical illustration of the degree of evidence that you can get for specialization. You could have strong evidence. So the syntax within syntax correlations are stronger than the within semantic correlations, which are also stronger than the across task correlations, right? So this pattern would be strong evidence. Weak evidence would be like, oh yeah, the within task correlations are high for the grammatical condition, higher than for the across, but not really different than the semantic, right? So that would be weak evidence. For semantic specialization, you can essentially look at the mirror image of the effects to show strong versus kind of weak evidence for specialization. You could have a scenario where a brain region is sensitive to both. So it may be that both the grammatical and the strongly congruent, right, are more highly correlated than the across task correlations, but these two are not different than one another, right? So that suggests that this area is sensitive to both syntax and semantics, or you could have a pattern where the voxels are sensitive to neither. So essentially there's no difference between any of the comparisons. So those are the different kind of scenarios, and we wanted to look to see whether we had evidence of specialization in these 5-year-olds. So this data here is for the middle temporal gyrus, the region that's supposed to be kind of more involved in semantics, and we do see some evidence for that. So the semantic task, the within semantic task correlation showed greater than across task correlations. This wasn't different than the syntax tasks. So this is kind of evidence for specialization, but it's weak evidence for specialization. We also looked at the superior temporal gyrus, and here we showed evidence for basically integration. So both the syntax and the semantic task within task correlations were greater than the across task correlations. So this suggests that this region integrates both syntax and semantics. And then finally, we looked at the frontal cortex, the brain regions here. This is more dorsal frontal cortex. So this is Brodmann's area 44. This is more ventral frontal cortex. So this is Brodmann's area 45 and 47. But you can see in both of these regions, the within task correlations were not different than the across task correlations, suggesting no specialization. So in summary, the multivoxel pattern analysis suggests that there is some semantic specialization in the middle temporal. There also seems to be evidence for integration of semantics and syntax in the superior temporal, but we saw no evidence for specialization in the frontal cortex. Perhaps we would get it with older children. In fact, we do. So we have some subsequent studies in the series of studies looking at 7-year-olds and 9-year-olds. And we show some evidence for specialization in the frontal cortex in these age groups, though I'm not going to present those today because of time. What I'd like to do in the remainder of this section of the lecture is to talk a little bit about these kind of other questions that are goals of the grant. So if you remember back, one of the additional questions was whether connectivity drives specialization. Remember, this is one of the central tenets of the interactive specialization theory. And then the other question was whether early specialization is related to later achievement. So in terms of the first question, we're actually we're testing that. We have a pre-registration investigating whether early connectivity between brain regions predicts later specialization. So we have this pre-registration looking at functional connectivity in the ventral pathway. And then we also have functional connectivity in the dorsal pathway. And we expect kind of the ventral connectivity to predict semantic specialization. And we predict like dorsal connectivity to predict phonological specialization. We actually have submitted this paper and we've gotten comments, favorable comments, but challenging ones. So we're in the process of kind of revising that paper. In terms of the second question, we've examined whether these early indices of specialization predict future behavioral performance. So in this context, we looked at phonological versus semantic specialization and whether this predicted reading gains. So yeah, the sound task, as you'd expect, as I presented before, is related to specialization in the superior temporal gyrus, whereas a meaning task is related to specialization in the middle temporal gyrus. So we wanted to look like whether these indices of specialization predicted behavioral reading gains. And we have a paper out showing that this is the case. So the phonological specialization predicted kind of reading growth from 6 to 7.5 years. So this work provides important evidence to constrain this interactive specialization theory of language development. in this age group, we didn't find that semantic specialization was predictive of reading gains. Although we're interested in looking at like the older cohort to see whether, yeah, semantic specialization is predictive of reading gains in kids who aren't beginning readers, so who are kind of, yeah, older, from 7 to 9 years old. Okay, so the last two questions in the grant focused on developmental language disorder. We actually, in the grant, had proposed to look at this in a continuous way. So we chose to treat language skill as a continuous variable. And remember, actually, we've already shown evidence that skill is related to specialization, right? So remember, we compared the phonological to the semantic task and showed that that was related to amount of activation in the superior temporal. And then we compared the semantic to the phonological task, and we showed that that was related to semantic skill, right? So we already have evidence that the individual differences in language are related to the magnitude of specialization. We're following that work up now, looking at whether language skill is related to semantic versus syntax specialization. So we have some projects looking at that. And that's important work because there isn't much work looking at like, yeah, low language skill or developmental language disorder, or more generally looking at individual differences in language skill and how that is instantiated in the brain. This is a review, the most recent review actually, looking at atypical language development. It's about a decade old now. But we actually haven't made a lot of progress since then. Limited conclusions can be drawn from the literature. At this point, we can say that there are some differences in the language network, but we're not quite sure what those are. Mostly the problem is small sample sizes. So lots of like, yeah, sample sizes in the teens. So yeah, results have been hard to replicate. There's one interesting study that's come out relatively recently. I think this study is with, if I remember, about 90 participants. So a largish study. They didn't find group differences when comparing developmental language disorder to typical kids. But when they treated language as a continuous variable, they showed that language skill was related to activation in, yeah, two important nodes of the language network. So inferior frontal and this kind of superior temporal into parietal cortex. So the language skill measure was verb generation, which is indicated here in red. So it suggests that core nodes of the language network may be altered in those with low language skill, but we clearly need more studies. Okay. Yeah, I see we're at about 1:45. So I'm just going to wrap up with some future directions. And these are basically, I'll kind of go through these at a general level, but these are projects that are kind of currently funded and kind of underway. Some of them are in my lab, some of them I'm doing collaboratively with kind of other folks, both at Vanderbilt and other universities. The first project that some of you may be familiar with is asking the question of whether higher reading skill in deaf and hard of hearing is associated with different pathways depending upon communication background. So this study is still ongoing. We're still recruiting kids who are deaf and hard of hearing. Children are given kind of functional localizers, asking whether these pictures rhyme or these pictures go together, so we can kind of localize phonology and semantics. And we see how those mechanisms are involved in reading. And we also have reading tasks that require kind of phonological judgments and semantic judgments. So we're expecting that those who are predominantly using oral language are likely to rely on this kind of dorsal pathway because they rely on the statistical regularities between letters and their sounds, whereas those who more often use sign language, maybe they're going to rely more on the ventral pathway. They rely more on the kind of direct mapping between kind of whole word spellings and their meanings. So that's one project underway in my lab. I also have a collaborative project with folks at University of Michigan, Yulia Kovelman. We're looking here at whether these two pathways develop differently in bilingual children who are English and Chinese. In this project, these kids are given kind of semantic task. Well, in this case, it's a morphological awareness task. They're also given a phonological task. Our previous work in English, as you've seen, shows that English readers for these phonology tasks rely more on this kind of dorsal pathway. Again, this is because English is a regular system, and you use this system to kind of map between letters and their sounds. So we expect dyslexia in English to be associated with differences in this pathway. We actually have separate work showing that Chinese readers tend to rely more on this ventral pathway. Those of you who are familiar with Chinese may know that it's a logosyllabic system. So the mappings between like the characters and the sounds are not very regular. So the idea is that they rely more on mapping of characters to meaning. So we expect those with dyslexia in Chinese to be associated with kind of differences in this ventral pathway, because that's what's crucial for reading in Chinese. I also have a collaborative project with Yulia Kovelman, which looks at neural bases of developmental language disorder in bilingual kids. In this case, it's Spanish versus English. Remember, I've just presented to you some of our work looking at specialization of these two pathways during sentence processing. So we showed in English, there's some kind of specialization for syntax and that kind of the dorsal kind of pathway. Actually, in other work, just within Spanish, we've shown that they also have specialization kind of in that pathway for syntax. But the core idea that we're testing in terms of developmental language disorder in these bilinguals is that, yeah, reduced language proficiency should be associated with less cortical specialization, right? So that would be like a replication of previous work that we've done in the lab. But the kind of unique component here is that the more dual language use is associated with greater cortical specificity. So more dual language use may mitigate the lack of cortical specificity in developmental language disorder and improve language outcomes. So that's kind of the core idea of that project. And we're in the midst of data collection. Another project that we're about in the second year in is looking at developmental trajectories of late talkers. Those of you who know about late talkers, we've been looking at this population for decades, but we don't have good methods to predict outcomes, so developmental trajectories. So some late talkers are late bloomers, so they catch up. Other ones are persistently delayed. but we can't effectively predict that. So the idea is, let's look at the kind of dorsal pathway involved in phonology, the ventral pathway involved in semantics, and try to see whether we can use behavior as well as brain measures to predict these developmental trajectories. And the last project I'm going to highlight, and then I'll wrap up with conclusions, is we're actually doing, this is with Sophia Vinci Boer here in Vanderbilt, but we're actually using a microgenetic approach. So the idea here is to collect neuroimages from 12 time points in kindergarten. So every month, we're about like 8 months into our first cohort, and it's going well. So the basic idea here is testing the interactive specialization model. So which is reflected here. We expect that increasing structural integrity is associated with a smaller lag in specialization. So this should be true for letters and also numbers. But because this is in kindergarten when kids are like, learning a lot about letters and numbers. But this shouldn't be true of faces and houses, right? Because by the time kids get to kindergarten, they are pretty good at processing faces and houses. We're going to use machine learning. Actually, we are using machine learning now to annotate Sesame Street images. It's a pretty cool project. We have been working with Sesame Street to, we've got all their videos, and we've been like, we want to put together tens of thousands of images, and we'll share those eventually for others to use. But the reason we're doing it for this study is to like have images that present letters, numbers, faces, and places in kind of like an ecologically valid way. Okay. So just to wrap up, and then I'll be happy to open up for discussion. To conclude, developmental disorders of language are common, but we lack an understanding of their neurocognitive basis. The interactive specialization model is useful for studying language acquisition. It's been very fruitful for us for thinking about how the brain changes over time. The bulk of the presentation was trying to convince you that we can show semantic and phonological specialization and also syntactic versus semantic specialization. But it seems to follow this trajectory of, first temporal and then frontal specialization. And then finally, I think the interactive specialization is not only useful for looking at typical development, but also cases where there may be altered development either due to constitutional or environmental factors. So with that, I'd like to just end. Again, thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions that you have.
Thank you, Dr. Booth. Thank you so much for your presentation and your lovely work. We are now ready. There are a few questions that are in our Q&A box. So audience, if you have any additional questions, please add them. And we know our panelists can't add their own. So if you are a panelist, you can also come up on screen and sign your question at any time. So the first question, well, I'll wait to ask the first question to see if anybody wants to come up and sign their question. Any students or Gallaudet community members want to come up and sign your question? While we're waiting for additional questions or someone to come up on screen, there are two in the Q&A feature. Let me open that up now. The first question, the question says, is phonological specialization also meant to be syntactic?
Yeah, that's a good question because I kind of like grouped them together. So the ventral pathway being involved in semantics, the dorsal pathway being more involved in phonology and syntax. Definitely an oversimplification. I think the reason that I kind of group phonology and syntax into kind of one pathway and talk about it here for simplicity is the idea that syntax and phonology are both like rule governed, in the sense that they're hierarchical and those kind of the nature of those representations follow kind of somewhat systematic kind of rules, whereas semantics is kind of more of an arbitrary relationship between the meaning and its referent. So in that way, you can group like phonology and syntax together. But there's, yeah, definitely evidence for kind of, I mean, you could compare phonological versus syntactic specialization in the dorsal pathway, and people have. I kind of glossed over that, but if you look at like work by Angela Frederici, for example, talks a lot about like premotor cortex into Brodmann's area 44, the opercularis as being involved in kind of phonology. But if you get a little further, more kind of anterior into the frontal operculum, which is like a big kind of crevice there, separating Brodmann's area 44 from 45. She and others argue that that's really involved in syntax, right? So I group them together here for simplicity, but that's a great question. They do seem to be distinct, although they are similar in the sense that they're both kind of rule governed and both seem to engage the dorsal pathway.
Thank you so much. Again, just wanted to check and see if any of our panelists wanted to come and ask a question in ASL. Okay. So let's move to another question from the Q&A. The question is asking, is this work too early to suggest possible interventions in order to improve development of reading skill in children?
Yeah, another great question. Yeah, I guess too early. Yeah, probably, but I think, you could speculate, I suppose, about particularly the like shared reading study that we looked at, how shared reading between the parent and child was related to specialization for language kind of in the brain. And we showed like, yeah, early shared reading was related more to like phonological specialization, whereas later shared reading was related more to kind of semantic specialization. And it seems to me that that may have some like, yeah, didactic or educational, implications. So maybe shared reading kind of early on should, at least a component of it should focus on the code. So in other words, the nature of the mapping, between the orthography and the phonology, whereas kind of when kids get a little bit older, maybe the shared reading practices should focus more on maybe the meaning. So the relationship between the spellings and their semantics. So that's kind of one example. I didn't talk about it much today, but we do have like a whole other kind of like line of work looking at neural bases of reading. Of course, everything I talked about today was kind of more on auditory processing of language, but our reading work seems to kind of converge on the idea that yeah, multi-sensory instruction and reading is really important, at least in hearing individuals. When we do these studies and we just visually present words, we see auditory cortex activation When we just present auditory words, we see visual cortex activation. Or when we present auditory or visual words, often we'll see motor activation associated with like either writing symbols with your hands or articulating in terms of oral speech. So yeah, I mean, I think the general conclusion from our work in reading is that like, yeah, multisensory instruction is very, very important. So yeah, I mean, there's some implications, I think, in terms of the cognitive neuroscientific work for education.
Thank you. It's nice to learn a little bit more about your perspective of what we can take from that research and bring into the homes with the families and parents. I appreciate that interpretation. Thank you. All right, the next on our list. So the next question is, when you're looking at deaf and hard of hearing children, are you using research of dual language, as in ASL and English, or just sign language?
Yeah. So it's been a bit of a challenge for us here in Nashville to get a sample of kids who are predominantly sign. So it seems as though kind of most of the folks that we see, of course, we can't do cochlear implants because it's fMRI. So we take out a bunch of those kids, you know, to start. And yeah, so it seems like our population is going to be mainly like kids who are predominantly oral, who have different levels of um, sign language exposure. And so we're going to look at kind of, yeah, how their, you know, different backgrounds are associated with the use of these two pathways. Turns out that, yeah, Nashville, it's been a challenge to study folks who are predominantly sign. Carly Lana, as you know, some of you know, was here, and yeah, she also discovered that, you know, it's a bit of a challenge. Wish we were in a community that had a larger deaf community like you know, Washington D.C. or Rochester or some of these other cities. Nashville, hopefully, will be I mean, it's attracting a lot of people, but I hope it attracts, you know, um, yeah, all different kinds of people. Yeah.
Thank you. And feel free to contact us at Gallaudet University. We'd be helpful. We'd be happy to support you and work with you to get more signing participants. Another question from Dr. Pizzi. Hello and thank you. So I'm just thinking about, and maybe related to the research on specialization from Dr. Rachel Romeo, who showed language development measures related to specificity in white matter development within children. So I think about your results that you shared with us today, showing specialization in the cortical regions. And how would you predict that that would impact that association with white matter, that structural relationship? Between the temporal lobe areas and the IFG. And specific structural correlations or also any kind of functional correlations as well?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. So we have done a study on the sample. It is pre-registered, so you can find it out there on OSF. We've analyzed the data, and we're writing it up. So yeah, my sense of the DTI literature is it's valuable. It's interesting, pretty contradictory because yeah, again, small sizes. Contradictory in the sense that different studies find different brain behavioral correlations in different tracks, and it's hard to make kind of heads or tails. So we're hopeful that our study with larger. I mean, we have like in this recent analysis, we have about 150 in one group and about 80 in the other group. So pretty largish samples. But we also took like a slightly different approach. Instead of just looking at the correlation of one behavioral measure to white matter, we tried to look at partial correlations to get an index of specificity of the relationship. Because if you take one behavioral measure and you show it's correlated with a white matter tract, you kind of like, well, yeah, it could be due to the construct that you're interested in, but it also could be due to lots of other things that um, you're not interested in. So we've used an approach where like we'll correlate like, I don't know, say the dorsal pathway with a phonological measure, and we will control for or partial out like nonverbal IQ and semantic processing and some other variables. So to try to establish a selective relationship of the dorsal pathway with phonology. And actually we have shown that in young kids, actually. So it's consistent with our shared reading measures. And in the older kids, we look at the ventral pathway and we try to predict white matter integrity with our semantic measures while controlling for other things that we're not interested in, like phonological processing, nonverbal IQ, and like other variables. Um, and then we find that just in the older kids. So it's actually consistent with the shared reading data. But now we have, I think I alluded to this, but we have another pre-registration where we've set up a similar approach. And yeah, we're very interested in whether, amount of reading from parent to child is associated with, white matter integrity in the dorsal pathway in the younger kids, whereas parent to child reading is associated with white matter integrity in the ventral pathway, kind of in the older kids. So yeah, Alicia Compton, a graduate student of mine for her dissertation, one of her chapters is going to kind of be on that. So yeah, we haven't done much white matter work. We've done a few studies in the past, but I think I like doing white matter studies, but it's also very helpful to like try to establish selective relationships somehow if ultimately you're interested in function. So we're also very interested in like actually correlating the fMRI response to the white matter integrity. So we have actually some thoughts about and some preliminary results on that kind of as well. Like, could we, use the specialization in our functional activation measures to see how that's related to white matter integrity? Yeah, so great question.
That's exciting. Exciting research to come. I look forward to seeing it. Thank you for a great question, Dr. Pizzi. We have two more questions in the Q&A. And again, if anybody wants to come up and ask a question on ASL. This question asks, in the study that looked at phonological specialization as a predictor of later reading skills, did you also look at behavioral measures like phonological awareness?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't remember. Not in that study. Yeah, I think so. That study was headed up by Brianna Yamasaki, who's now um, she's a faculty member at Emory, and she did have a project actually looking at phonological and semantic specialization. Again, it's pre-registered out there, but we never quite finished the analysis. She moved on, so hopefully we'll get back to it sometime. But yeah, looking at phonological and semantic specialization at the 5-year-olds and the kind of 7-year-olds and predicting brain and behavior across time. Um, so she did do some of that work. I would have to like go back and look at it. It's a very interesting question. So there's some,
That's fine. Sometimes, it's easy to forget when you've got a lot of
yeah,
studies going on.
yeah, no, but
We all understand that.
it's a very
We've all
interesting
experienced that
question.
before.
Oh, sorry. It's a very interesting question because there's some like theories out there about like how your lexical representations kind of develop. Is it like you need a certain number of like phonological word forms to kind of bootstrap onto semantic development, or whether, knowing about the meanings of words allows you to like learn the phonology. So, I mean, this idea of like, you know, which pace is which, does that change over time? Like, I guess some people have referred to it as, often you hear of syntactic versus semantic bootstrapping, but people have also talked about like phonological versus semantic bootstrapping. So, yeah, interesting question. Um, to be continued, I guess.
Yeah, and we do have one more question.
Mhm.
And if anybody wants to come up and sign their question, they still can, but one more in the Q&A. This question asks, have you looked at whether there is any association between the degree of lateralization and DLD?
Mhm. Yeah. Um, we have generally not looked at lateralization. It just it turns out that the nature of our questions hasn't really focused on that. Sorry, but we basically look at the left hemisphere. I know that will, annoy people who are interested in left versus right hemisphere processing of language. Certainly, the right hemisphere is involved in language processing. We know that. Yeah, I mean, it's the same with like, we don't really look at the cerebellum. And my lab generally takes a pretty region of interest approach. So we like focus on particular regions and we really try to interrogate those regions in an a priori way. I'm not saying it's a better approach. It's approach that we take because of the questions we have. Um, uh, I would refer you actually to Dorothy Bishop. She actually has like she's retired now, but she's still active, and she actually has a review paper reviewing the literature on DLD and language lateralization, whether there's a difference between DLD and typicals. I think the long and short of it is that if there is an effect, it's weak. So, in other words, there doesn't seem to be robust evidence to suggest a difference in hemispheric lateralization between those with and without um, uh, language disorders. But check out Dorothy Bishop's work. I think she has a recent review paper if you haven't seen it.
All right, thank you for the recommendation. Okay, just wanted to check in and see if anyone has any last questions. And then one last question from me is that one of your studies you mentioned um, the environment, an enriched environment, and other topics related to the type of things within the environment. Could you expand a little bit more about what you meant with that environmental context? And what exactly are you looking at?
Yeah. Um, so yeah, we have a questionnaire that we administered to these 5, 7, and 9-year-olds. It's called the ECLK, the Early Childhood ECLK. It's basically like a questionnaire that you give parents, focusing on like reading activities in the home, but also focusing on extracurricular activities. In hindsight, it wasn't probably the best measure, but it was used by this big longitudinal study a while back, and we decided to adopt it. We have this new study looking at late talkers, and in that study, we actually have which I think is a better measure, which is the STIM Q, STIM hyphen Q. That looks at like cognitive stimulation kind of in the home, and I think that is a bit more comprehensive. We're also actually pretty interested in exercise or involvement in like physical activity in and out of the home. So we have like an extensive questionnaire looking at physical activity and exercise, because there's a lot of evidence to suggest that that's related to brain development. So yeah, we're trying to do a better job now of looking at characteristics in the home. We did have a supplement out that wasn't funded, but we did want to, in this late talker project, get into the home and like take some ecological recordings using Lena, but we didn't successfully compete for that supplement. It was I don't know, maybe some of you have heard of Kid Talk, which is like an initiative through NIH to fund work on late talkers. So yeah, I mean we're pretty limited in terms of the nature of the measures that we kind of have in that shared data set. We seem to like narrow down on like amount of shared reading between parent and child as like probably the best measure of like cognitive stimulation in the home um, in our data set. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. And if anyone has any final questions, now is the time. If not, we will close the webinar. And again, Dr. Booth, thank you so much for coming. Thank you everyone for watching the presentation. We appreciate everyone's questions and comments. And we had one nice comment from your past postdoc, Carly Leanna, who put a comment in the chat for you. In total, we had 68 individuals come, real nice audience. So again, thank you everyone and enjoy the rest of your day.
And thank you.
And again, our take-home message is go read with your kids.
Yeah.
Exercise
Yeah.
and exercise with your kids.
Right. Yeah, although we don't have to write, I mean, there is a ton of evidence suggesting exercise is important, but yeah, certainly reading. And thanks for all
It
the
can't hurt, right?
Yeah, no, it's definitely. And thanks for all the kind comments. I've been able to follow them all in the chat, but I see that a lot of people have been responding and saying nice things, and I do appreciate your attention and listening. And if anybody has any follow-ups that comes to them after the talk, I'd be happy to like have a conversation with you. Just reach out.
Great, thank you so much. And also follow VL2 for following talks this year. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.